My son, David, the one for whom I had willingly, lovingly, mortgaged my own modest home, the home where his father and I had built a lifetime of memories, all to pay off the staggering gambling debts he'd accumulated, the kind of debts that brought shadowy figures with cold eyes and even colder threats knocking on his door, threatening not his kneecaps, but the very fabric of his precarious existence. That same son, he kicked me out, not 3 months after I'd signed away my security, my peace of mind, the last tangible piece of his father's legacy. He and his new wife, Brenda, a woman whose smile was as bright and brittle as cheap costume jewelry and never quite managed to thaw the icy calculation in her eyes, informed me that the small converted shed I'd been moved into on their newly acquired, rather grand property, a property bought, of course, with the sudden influx of cash I'd freed up for them by settling his catastrophic financial mess, was now urgently needed for Brenda's burgeoning and hitherto unknown passion for artisanal pottery, an art studio she'd called it, her voice dripping with a false sweetness that set my teeth on edge. They spoke of space and creative energies, as if I, his mother, the woman who had birthed him, nursed him, sacrificed for him, were nothing more than an inconvenient obstruction to their artistic and domestic bliss. They looked at my worn cardigan, my sensible shoes, my quiet, grief-stricken demeanor, and they saw an old woman, easily dismissed, a relic of a past they were eager to shed. They thought I'd just fade away, a grateful, senile footnote in their shiny new life, happy for the scraps of their attention, the crumbs of their table. They didn't know that in the quiet desperation of those first few weeks, when the weight of his betrayal had settled upon me like a physical shroud, I had insisted, with a clarity that had surprised even myself, on him signing a series of legally binding promissory notes for every single cent I had borrowed against my own future, to salvage his. They were tucked away, those papers crisp and damning, in the lining of my old handbag, a testament not to my foresight, but to a sudden inexplicable moment of self-preservation in the face of overwhelming maternal fear. They didn't know that the old woman they were so casually casting aside possessed a memory as sharp as a shard of glass, and a spirit, though battered, not yet broken. They didn't know I was about to call in a debt far greater, far more encompassing, than mere money. This is the story of how I, Eleanor Ainsworth, took back not just my financial security, but my dignity, my home, my very life, piece by painstaking, legally binding piece. It began, as these descents into familial hell often do, with a frantic, tearful phone call from Dave. His voice, usually so full of a blustering, unearned confidence, was thin, reedy, laced with a terror I hadn't heard since he was a small boy, waking from a nightmare. "Mom," he'd choked out, "I'm in trouble. Real trouble, the kind that doesn't just go away." The details, when they tumbled out in a torrent of self-pity and barely concealed panic, were uglier than I could have imagined. Gambling debts, he'd confessed, not to some respectable casino, but to shadowy, illicit operations, the kind that employed enforcers with names like Knuckles and the Ham. He'd started small, a flutter here, a wager there, fueled by that same reckless optimism that had always been his Achilles heel, but it had spiraled, as these things do, into a terrifying abyss of ever-increasing stakes, of desperate attempts to recoup losses, of a debt that now loomed over him like a guillotine. They'd given him a deadline, he'd sobbed, a week, or else. The "or else" was left unsaid, but its chilling implication hung heavy in the air between us. My blood ran cold. This was my son, my only child, the boy whose scraped knees I had kissed, whose fevers I had nursed, whose every small triumph had filled my heart with a fierce maternal pride. How could I not help him? What mother could stand by and watch her child be destroyed? The sum was staggering, far beyond anything I possessed in ready cash. My savings, carefully hoarded from years of part-time work at the local haberdashery, after his father, my gentle hard-working Arthur, had passed. Were a pittance against such a monstrous figure. There was only one way. The house, our home, the small, neat bungalow Arthur and I had bought, as newlyweds. The place where David had taken his first steps, where our lives had unfolded in a tapestry of ordinary, precious, everyday moments. The thought of mortgaging it, of placing that beloved sanctuary at risk, was a physical pain, a desecration, but the thought of David, broken, beaten, perhaps worse, was unbearable. Brenda, whom David had married in a whirlwind romance, just 6 months prior, a woman whose perfectly lacquered exterior seemed to conceal a core of pure, unadulterated self-interest, was predictably no. She'd wrung her hands, shed a few artful tears, and lamented their terrible luck, all while subtly, insidiously, reinforcing the unspoken assumption that I, his mother, was his only viable lifeline. "Oh, Eleanor," she'd sighed, her voice dripping with a false sympathy that made my skin crawl. "You're so strong, so capable. David and I, we just don't know what we'd do without you. You're his only hope, his only hope." The words echoed in my mind, a heavy, unwelcome burden. And so, I had done it. I had walked into the bank, my heart a leaden weight in my chest, and signed the papers, my signature, usually so firm, a shaky, hesitant scrawl. I had sold a few pieces of Arthur's mother's jewelry, heirlooms, I had treasured, to cover the immediate pressing demands of David's more unsavory creditor. And then, with a clarity that surprised even myself, a sudden, inexplicable surge of caution, I had insisted that David sign the promissory notes. "Just a formality, dear," I'd said, my voice belying the turmoil in my heart. "So we both know where we stand, alone, between mother and son, to be repaid when you're back on your feet." He'd agreed readily enough, his relief at his salvation so overwhelming that he would have signed away his own soul at that point, let alone a few pieces of paper. Brenda had watched, her eyes narrowed, a flicker of something unreadable in their cool depths. Gratitude, when it came from David, was effusive, almost theatrical. He'd wept, he'd hugged me, he'd sworn he'd repay every penny, that he'd learned his lesson, that he'd never gamble again. Brenda's gratitude was more restrained, a polite, "Thank you, Eleanor. You've been very generous," as if I just treated them to an expensive dinner, not mortgaged my entire future to save her feckless husband from a fate I dared not contemplate. The immediate crisis averted, David and Brenda, now flush with the remaining funds from my refinanced mortgage, funds I had naively assumed would be used to start repaying the loan, or at least to build a more stable future, announced their intention to invest in property. A small farm, just outside town, with a rambling old farmhouse, and a rather dilapidated guest cottage. "It's a wonderful opportunity, Mom," David had enthused, his old reckless optimism resurfacing with alarming speed. "A chance to build something real, something lasting. And the cottage, it would be perfect for you. You wouldn't have to worry about the upkeep of your old place anymore. We could look after you. It would be ideal." Ideal for whom? I now wondered, as I stared at my faded floral suitcase, the symbol of my dispossession, sitting forlornly by the door. The transition had been swift, almost seamless. My bungalow, now bearing a for sale sign, its future uncertain, its memories already beginning to fade. Me installed in the perfect guest cottage, a space barely large enough for a bed, a chair, and my own encroaching sense of unease. And David and Brenda, lording it over the main farmhouse, already talking of renovations, of expansions. Their gratitude, it seemed as fleeting and insubstantial as the morning mist over the Idaho fields. The looking after me part of the arrangement had of course quickly devolved into me looking after them, or rather, their increasingly neglected children, while they pursued their farm management dreams. Dreams that seemed to involve a lot of expensive consultants and very little actual farming. And then, the art studio. Brenda's sudden, inexplicable, and apparently non-negotiable need for an artisanal pottery studio. My cottage, my last small sliver of independence, my final refuge, was, it seemed, the only suitable location. "You understand, don't you, Mom?" David had said, his eyes avoiding mine, his voice tinged with that familiar, wheedling impatience. Brenda needs her creative space, and well, you can move into the spare room in the main house. It's cozier, smaller, more easily controlled, more easily dismissed. And so, the suitcase, the final, brutal act of erasure. But they had miscalculated, they had mistaken my grief for weakness, my love for stupidity, my silence for surrender. They had forgotten about the promissory note. They had forgotten about the quiet, unyielding strength of a mother pushed too far, and they were about to learn the hard, expensive, and legally binding way that this particular piece of baggage was about to become a very, very heavy load to bear. My first call, after settling into a small, bleak, but blessedly anonymous, motel room in the nearby town, was not to a friend, not to a relative. It was to Miss Alistair Finch, the solicitor who had handled Arthur's will, a man known for his sharp mind, his unwavering integrity, and his rather formidable reputation for dealing with complicated family matters. Mr. Finch, I began, my voice surprisingly steady. It's Eleanor Ainsworth. I believe I find myself in a situation that requires your particular expertise. The game, I thought, as I outlined the sordid tale of my son's debts, my mortgaged home, the promissory notes, and my subsequent brutal eviction, was well and truly and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt a flicker of something other than despair. I felt the initial shock of my eviction, the raw visceral pain of Sarah and Mark's betrayal, began to slowly recede, replaced by a cold, hard anger, a quiet, unyielding resolve that surprised even myself. Golden Meadows, with its beige walls, and its relentless, institutional cheerfulness, was not a place I intended to quietly fade away in. It was, I decided, merely a temporary holding pattern, a staging ground for my own, long overdue, reclamation project. Martha, my dear, indomitable friend, became my trusted co-conspirator, her sharp mind, and her even sharper tongue, a constant source of strength, and often, much needed amusement. We'd spend hours in her cluttered, comfortable living room, surrounded by her unruly collection of books, and her equally unruly, but entirely lovable, ginger tomcat, Bismarck, plotting our strategy, fueled by endless cups of strong tea, and Martha's surprisingly potent, homemade elderflower wine. Right, Eleanor, she'd said, after I'd recounted the full sordid tale of my dispossession, her eyes blazing with a righteous fury that did my old heart good. First things first, we need to get that charlatan, Mr. Henderson, on the phone. We need to ascertain, with absolute clarity, the current legal status of your Ohio home, and the precise nature of any arrangements Sarah and that odious husband of hers might have made regarding its ownership or your finances. Forewarned, my dear, is forearmed, and we, I assure you, are going to be very, very well armed. Mr. Henderson, when I finally reached him, his voice a little frailer than I remembered, but his mind still, as sharp as a tack, was, as expected, horrified by what had transpired. He confirmed that the Ohio house was still, legally, and unequivocally in my name. He also, with a quiet, professional indignation, detailed the alarming pattern of withdrawals from my pension account, the unexplained household expenses that had so mysteriously escalated since I'd moved in with Sarah and Mark. The forged power of attorney, he assured me, was a clear case of fraud, a criminal offense, and he would pursue it with the full, unmitigated rigor of the law. His validation, his unwavering support, was a powerful tonic. It solidified my resolve, banishing the last, lingering vestiges of self-doubt, of maternal guilt. This was not about revenge, not entirely. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully mine. It was about ensuring that my legacy, my final word, would be a testament not to their greed, but to my own quiet, enduring strength. The new will, the one that named Martha as my primary beneficiary, with the educational trust for Ben and Emily, still firmly in place, felt like a profound act of self-affirmation. It was a declaration of my own worth, my own agency, a quiet, but powerful statement that my love, my life, my legacy, were mine to bestow, not theirs to demand or usurp. We decided, Martha and I, with Mr. Henderson's sage counsel, to proceed on two fronts. First, the legal battle to reclaim my Ohio home, to nullify the fraudulent power of attorney, to recover the misappropriated funds. This, Mr. Henderson warned, would likely be a long, arduous, and potentially unpleasant process. Sarah and Mark, he suspected, would not relinquish their ill-gotten gains without a fight. Second, and this was Martha's rather brilliant, if somewhat unorthodox suggestion, a more personal form of communication. A letter, Eleanor, she'd said, her eyes twinkling with a mischievous glee. A letter to your dear daughter, Sarah. Not an angry letter. Not a recriminatory one, oh no. Something far more subtle, more effective. A letter informing her, in the most poignant, heartfelt and utterly devastatingly polite terms, of your profound disappointment, your shattered maternal heart, and most importantly, of the significant revisions you have recently made to your last will and testament. Let her stew in that particular pot of guilt-laced anxiety for a while, my dear. It will, I assure you, do wonders for her digestion, and perhaps, just perhaps, for her long overdue moral awakening. The thought of such a letter, of the impact it might have, filled me with a strange mixture of trepidation and a grim, almost guilty satisfaction. It felt a way to communicate the depth of my pain, the finality of my decision, in a way that could not be dismissed, ignored, or manipulated. I spent many solitary evenings at the small, rickety desk in my Golden Meadows room, penning draft after draft of that letter. It was, perhaps, the hardest thing I had ever written. How to convey a lifetime of love, a universe of hurt, in a few carefully chosen paragraphs. How to express the profound, irrevocable severing of a bond that had once been the very anchor of my existence. I wrote of my love for her, from the moment she was born, a tiny, perfect miracle in my arms. I wrote of Daniel, of our shared dreams for her future. I wrote of the sacrifices made, not as a means of inducing guilt, but as a statement of fact, a testament to the depth of my maternal devotion. And then, I wrote of the betrayal, of the temporary stay that had become a permanent exile, of the casual cruelties, the dismissive words, the ultimate, brutal act of being cast out, my suitcase a symbol of my dispossession. You called me baggage, Sarah, I wrote, my hand trembling slightly as the words flowed onto the page. You said I was holding you back. You and Mark decided I was an inconvenience, an anachronism, an embarrassment to be streamlined out of your lives. You were wrong. I was your mother. I was your children's grandmother, and I was, and still am, a woman of worth, of dignity, of a love that you so carelessly, so cruelly discarded. My legacy, Sarah, the fruits of my life's labor, of your father's hard work, will now reflect that truth. It will honor not biological obligation, but genuine kindness, respect, and the enduring power of true, unwavering friendship. The enclosed copy of my revised will speaks for itself. I wish you well. I hope, one day, you find the happiness you are so desperately, and it seems, so destructively, pursuing, but you will find it, I assure you, without the benefit of my inheritance. I sealed the letter, along with a notarized copy of the new will, in a sturdy manila envelope, addressed to Sarah, in my neat, old-fashioned script. I gave it to Mr. Henderson, with instructions that it be delivered to her personally, by registered post, the following week. There would be no dramatic confrontations, no tearful recriminations in my lifetime, beyond what had already transpired. My final word would be delivered quietly, legally, and I hoped, with a devastating, and perhaps, just perhaps, a transformative impact. The die was cast. The suitcase, once a symbol of my despair, now felt like a declaration of war, a quiet war. Yes, but a war I was, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, determined to win. The arrival of my letter, and the accompanying copy of my revised will, at Sarah and Mark's new, streamlined home in that distant city, had, according to Mr. Henderson, who had, with a certain grim satisfaction, arranged for a rather officious-looking courier to deliver it, an effect that could only be described as seismic. Mr. Henderson, bless his discreet and legally minded soul, did not share the full, lurid details of Sarah's reaction, but he did permit himself a small dry chuckle when he recounted her initial frantic and apparently rather hysterical phone call to his office. She seemed surprised, Eleanor, he'd said, his voice laced with an almost imperceptible irony, profoundly surprised. And I gather, not entirely pleased. Surprised, yes, I imagined she was. Sarah and Mark had so thoroughly convinced themselves of my meek acquiescence, my senile incompetence, my utter inability to challenge their authority, that the thought of me taking such a decisive, such an uncharacteristic step must have been a shock of monumental proportion. Their carefully constructed narrative of the loving, if somewhat burdensome, mother, gratefully accepting their generous offer of a secure and comfortable retirement at Golden Meadows, while they, with a heavy heart, managed her increasingly complex affairs, had just been blown to smithereens. The calls from Sarah began a few days later, not to me directly, of course. That would have required a level of courage, or perhaps just basic human decency, she clearly no longer possessed. No, the calls were to Martha, frantic, tearful, accusatory calls, in which she railed against my cruelty, my vindictiveness, my ingratitude. She accused Martha of manipulating me, of poisoning me, against my own family, of scheming to get her hands on my money. Martha, to her eternal credit, handled these tirades with her customary aplomb, her responses a magnificent blend of icy disdain and withering sarcasm. My dear Sarah, she'd reportedly said, during one particularly memorable exchange, your mother, I assure you, is in full possession of her faculties. Indeed, I would venture to say her mind is sharper, and her resolve stronger, than it has been in years. As for her will, it is, as it should be, a reflection of her own considered wishes, and if those wishes do not happen to align with your own, rather, optimistic, expectations, well, that, my dear, is a consequence of your own actions, is it not? One reaps, as they say, what one sows. And you, Sarah, appear to have sown a rather bumper crop of disappointment. Sarah, apparently, had not appreciated Martha's agricultural metaphors. The legal battle to reclaim my Ohio home, and to untangle the web of their financial deceit, continued its slow, inexorable grind. Mark and Sarah, through their increasingly desperate legal team, fought every step of the way, their tactics growing more aggressive, their accusations more outlandish, as their position became increasingly untenable. They even had the audacity to attempt to have me declared legally incompetent, a move so transparently self-serving, so utterly devoid of any factual basis, that it was dismissed by the court with an almost contemptuous swiftness. It was a deeply unpleasant, often exhausting process. There were days when the sheer ugliness of it all, the relentless barrage of lies and distortions, threatened to overwhelm me. Days when I longed for the simple peace of my old life, for Daniel's quiet strength, for a world where a mother's love was not seen as a resource to be plundered, a weakness to be exploited. But then I would think of Martha, her fierce, unwavering loyalty. I would think of Mr. Henderson, his calm, steadfast professionalism. I would think of Ben and Emily, my precious, lost grandchildren, whose futures I was, in my own small way, trying to protect. And I would find, somewhere deep within myself, a fresh reserve of strength, of determination. I would not be broken. I would not be silenced. I would see this through. The turning point, I believe, came during a particularly grueling deposition. Sarah and Mark's lawyer, a man whose smarmy condescension was almost as offensive as his ill-fitting toupee, was attempting to portray me as a confused, embittered old woman, easily swayed, fundamentally incapable of understanding the complexities of my own financial affairs. Miss Vance, he'd said, his voice dripping with a false sympathy, are you quite sure you understood the nature of the documents your daughter asked you to sign? Is it not possible that, in your distress, after your husband's passing, you might have misinterpreted her intention? that she was merely trying to help you manage things. I had looked him directly in the eye, my gaze steady, my voice, when I spoke, surprisingly firm. "Mr. Albright," I'd said, using his name with a deliberate, icy precision. My distress after my husband's passing was profound, but it did not, I assure you, impair my intellect. I understood perfectly well what my daughter and her husband were doing. They were systematically, and with a callousness that still takes my breath away, divesting me of my home, my savings, my dignity. They were not helping me manage things. They were helping themselves to my life. And if that is a complexity you find difficult to grasp, then perhaps, sir, it is your understanding, and not mine, that is in question. A stunned silence had descended upon the room. Even Martha, bless her, had looked momentarily taken aback by my uncharacteristic ferocity. The lawyer, his smarmy composure visibly shaken, had stammered a hasty retreat, his line of questioning abruptly abandoned. From that moment on, the tide seemed to turn. The evidence of their deceit, so meticulously compiled by Mr. Henderson, was irrefutable. Their carefully constructed facade of filial concern, of victimhood, crumbled under the weight of their own demonstrable grief. The wheels of justice, though grinding slowly, were, I sensed, finally, inexorably, beginning to turn in my favor. The fight was far from over, I knew, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to feel a flicker of something I hadn't dared to feel for a very long time: hope, a fierce, defiant, and utterly exhilarating hope. It had a small balcony overlooking a shared garden, already bursting with late spring flowers. It had a bright, airy living room, perfect for my books, my knitting, and my newfound, if still rather clumsy, attempts at watercolor paint. And it was blessedly, wonderfully, free of any association with Sarah, with Mark, with the painful detritus of my recent past. The proceeds from the sale of the Ohio house, combined with the partial restitution of funds recovered from Sarah and Mark, a process that was, as Miss Henderson had predicted, ongoing and fraught with difficulty, as their own financial situation had apparently imploded, rather spectacularly, in the wake of the court judgment, were not a vast fortune, but they were enough for me to live comfortably, to pursue my quiet hobbies, to indulge in small pleasures, a new book, a good quality tea, an occasional outing with Martha, to a local art exhibition, or a matinee performance at the community theater, enough to ensure that my final wish, as stipulated in my revised will, the educational trust for Ben and Emily, the bequest to Martha, my fierce, loyal friend, and a significant donation to a local charity supporting victims of elder abuse, a cause that now resonated with a particular, poignant urgency, could be fully realized. Of Sarah and Mark, I heard very little. They had apparently faded into a self-inflicted obscurity, their once bright ambitions extinguished, their carefully constructed world of entitlement and effortless superiority, now a pile of smoldering ashes. I felt no triumph in their downfall, only a distant, weary sadness. They were the architects of their own misfortune, and their story for me was well and truly over. My story, however, was not. It was entering a new, unexpected, and surprisingly liberating a chapter filled not with bitterness or regret, but with a quiet, resilient, and deeply satisfying peace. The suitcase, that faded floral symbol of my dispossession, now sat in the back of my new wardrobe, a reminder not of loss, but of a journey undertaken, a battle fought, a victory, however hard won, achieved. The dead weight had not just been unburdened, it had been reborn. The epilogue to this rather tumultuous chapter of my life was written not in grand pronouncements or dramatic confrontations, but in the quiet everyday rhythms of my new existence. Life in my sunny little apartment, with Martha, just a brisk, opinionated walk away, settled into a comfortable, unassuming contentment. The scars of Sarah and Mark's betrayal, though they would likely always remain, began to fade, their sharp edges softened by the gentle balm of time, of peace, of new, uncomplicated joys. I rediscovered old hobbies, old passions. My watercolors, once hesitant and clumsy, began to take on a surprising vibrancy. My small canvases, filled with renderings, of the flowers in our shared garden, the changing light on the distant hills, the comical, imperious expressions of Martha's ginger tomcat. I joined the village library's Great Reads book club, engaging in spirited, often hilarious debates about everything from classic literature to contemporary thriller. I even, to Martha's undisguised amusement, took up Tai Chi, my movements slow, a little creaky perhaps, but imbued with a new, quiet sense of grace, of centeredness. The educational trust for Ben and Emily was established, their futures in that small practical way. I continued to write them letters, entrusting them to Mr. Henderson, hopeful that one day, when they were old enough to understand, they might read them, and in them find a glimpse of the grandmother they had been denied, the love that, despite everything, still resided in my heart. Of Sarah, I heard almost nothing. She had, it seemed, vanished into the anonymity of her own diminished circumstances. There were no further attempts at contact, no apologies, no acknowledgments. It was as if our shared history, our mother-daughter bond, had been irrevocably, irreparably severed. And while a part of me, the maternal part, would always grieve that loss, another stronger part, the part that had fought so hard to reclaim its own dignity, its own worth, knew that some doors, once closed, are best left undisturbed. My friendship with Martha deepened, becoming the bedrock of my later years. We were an unlikely pair, perhaps, I, with my quiet reserve, she, with her booming laugh, and her delightfully irreverent opinions, but we understood each other. We had weathered our own storms, faced our own losses, and had emerged, not unscathed, but unbowed. We were, as Martha often proclaimed, two old broads, still standing, still sassy, and still, thank God, capable of appreciating a damn fine cup of tea and a thoroughly disreputable piece of gossip. My legacy, I knew, was secure, not just in the legal documents safely lodged in Mr. Henderson's vault, but in the life I was now living, a life of quiet contentment, of simple pleasures, of genuine, uncomplicated friendship, a life lived on my own terms, free from the shackles of obligation, of expectation, of the crushing weight of unreciprocated love. The suitcase, that faded floral symbol of my initial despair, now held a different meaning. It was a reminder not of what I had lost, but of what I had gained: resilience, strength, independence, and a profound, unshakable understanding of my own intrinsic worth. The dead weight had not just been unburdened, it had learned to soar, and as I sat on my sunny little porch, a cup of fragrant Earl Grey in my hand, the scent of roses and lavender from my small, flourishing garden, mingling with the crisp autumn air, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that Eleanor Vance, the old woman, the discarded luggage, had finally, truly, and gloriously found her way home, to herself, and that, I realized, was the most precious, the most enduring legacy of all.